When 11 flak shells tore through a B-17 Flying Fortress fuel tank at 23,000 feet over Nazi Germany, and not a single one ignited, was it divine intervention, engineering miracle, or something else entirely? This is the story of the Lady Luck, a bomber that defied the laws of physics and probability on March 6, 1944, during the first maximum effort daylight raid against Berlin. Over 600 heavy bombers would participate in what the 8th Air Force called Mission 250, the most ambitious and dangerous operation yet attempted against the heart of Nazi Germany. Aboard aircraft number 42-31367 were 10 young Americans, average age 22, flying their 18th mission into the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. The German capital bristled with more than 400 heavy flak guns, each capable of firing 17-pound shells at a rate of 15 rounds per minute. By the end of that day, 69 American bombers would be shot from the sky, over 690 men killed, captured, or missing. But Lady Luck would come home. Her survival would become one of the most studied incidents in aviation history, challenging everything engineers thought they knew about fuel systems, combustion, and the thin line between survival and catastrophe at 23,000 feet. This is that story. The B-17G Flying Fortress serial number 42-31367, nicknamed Lady Luck by her ground crew, belonged to the 381st Bombardment Group, 533rd Squadron, stationed at Ridgewell Airfield in Essex, England. She was one of 12,731 B-17s built during the war, but her story would prove unique. Her pilot, First Lieutenant James Robert Patterson of Des Moines, Iowa, had been flying combat missions since December 1943. At 24, he was older than most pilots, a calm, methodical officer who'd washed out of fighter training due to poor eyesight but found his calling in the left seat of a heavy bomber. His co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Frank Morrison, 21 years old, from Portland, Oregon, was on his 12th mission. Together, they commanded a crew that had evolved from nervous replacements into a tight-knit fighting unit. The crew roster read like a cross-section of wartime America. Navigator Second Lieutenant Charles Brennan, a former mathematics teacher from Boston. Bombardier Second Lieutenant William Hastings, a farm boy from Nebraska who could calculate wind drift and bombing angles faster than most men could read a newspaper. Flight Engineer Technical Sergeant Robert McKenzie, a Detroit mechanic who understood the B-17 systems better than the designers at Boeing. Radio Operator Technical Sergeant Michael O'Malley from Brooklyn. Ball Turret Gunner Staff Sergeant Raymond Chen, one of the few Chinese Americans in the 8th Air Force. Waist Gunners Staff Sergeant Donald Price and Staff Sergeant Albert Kowalski. Tail Gunner Staff Sergeant James Tucker from rural Tennessee. Each man a specialist, each man essential. The B-17G they flew represented the pinnacle of American heavy bomber design in early 1944. 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines, each producing 1,200 horsepower. Maximum takeoff weight of 65,000 pounds. Defensive armament of 1350 caliber machine guns. Bomb load capacity of 8,000 pounds, though typical combat loads ran closer to 6,000 to extend range. But the most critical system, the one that would matter most on March 6, was the fuel system. The B-17G carried fuel in 9 self-sealing tanks, 4 main tanks in the wings, 4 auxiliary Tokyo tanks also in the wings, and 1 Bombardier's tank in the nose. Total capacity, 2,700 gallons of 100-octane aviation gasoline, enough for a combat radius of approximately 800 miles. The self-sealing technology was revolutionary. Each fuel cell consisted of multiple layers: an outer vulcanized rubber coating resistant to petroleum, a nylon barrier, a rubber sealant that expanded when exposed to fuel, a layer of rayon fabric, and finally an inner layer of synthetic rubber. When a bullet or small fragment penetrated the tank, fuel would seep into the sealant layer, causing it to swell and plug the hole. The system worked remarkably well against rifle-caliber rounds and small shrapnel. But it was never designed to handle what was coming. March 1944 marked a critical turning point in the strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany. For months, the 8th Air Force had suffered devastating losses attempting to strike deep into the Reich without adequate fighter escort. The Schweinfurt raids of 1943 had cost 60 bombers in a single day, a 20% loss rate that couldn't be sustained. Entire groups had been decimated. Replacement crews arrived at bases in England and died before learning their squadron mates' names. Everything changed with the arrival of the P-51 Mustang equipped with drop tanks. Suddenly, American fighters could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The strategic situation shifted from survival to offensive action. The Luftwaffe could no longer pick off bomber formations at will. German fighters now had to contend with swarms of Mustangs eager to engage them. Berlin itself, Big B as the air crews called it, remained the most dangerous target on the map. The Nazi capital represented more than industrial targets and rail yards. It was a symbol, the heart of Hitler's Reich. Both sides understood its significance. The Germans would defend it with everything they had. The Americans would attack it to prove they could. The mission briefing on the morning of March 6 drew collective groans when the intelligence officer pulled back the curtain to reveal the red yarn stretching all the way to Berlin. "Gentlemen," he announced, "today we're knocking on Hitler's front door. 730 heavy bombers. This is the largest daylight raid ever mounted against the German capital." The briefing room fell silent. Every man in that Quonset hut knew what Berlin meant: maximum effort, maximum risk. The intelligence officer continued. "Primary target is the Erkner ball-bearing works and industrial areas in the city center. Secondary targets include rail yards and tank factories. Expected opposition, heavy and accurate flak throughout the target area. Luftwaffe fighter response, extreme. Expect concentrated attacks from takeoff to landing." He paused, letting that sink in. Weather over target, partial cloud cover, visibility 3 to 5 miles. Winds aloft 25 knots from the west. Fighter escort will be provided by the 4th, 56th, and 357th Fighter Groups flying P-51s and P-47s. They'll stay with you as long as fuel permits. Takeoff was scheduled for 8:30 hours. 14 combat wings would participate. The 381st Bombardment Group would fly in the high squadron of the 94th Combat Wing, a position that offered some protection from fighter attacks but put them squarely in the flak field. Patterson sat in that briefing room and watched his crew's faces. They were scared, everyone was scared, but they were ready. 18 missions down, 7 to go before their tour was complete and they could go home. Just 7 more. Little did they know that mission 250 would test them in ways no training could prepare them for. Lady Luck's engines coughed to life at 8:15 hours. The distinctive sound of radial engines firing, a bark, then a rumble, then a steady roar as all 4 Wright Cyclones settled into synchronized rhythm. The bomber shuddered with barely contained power, straining against the brakes. At 8:47 hours, Patterson released the brakes and Lady Luck began her takeoff roll. 65,000 pounds of aluminum, steel, fuel, bombs, and humanity accelerated down Ridgewell's main runway. The tail came up at 50 miles per hour. At 90 miles per hour, Patterson eased back on the yoke and the bomber broke ground, clawing for altitude with a full combat load of 12 500-pound general-purpose bombs and 2,700 gallons of high-octane fuel. The fuel distribution was critical to understanding what would happen later. The 4 main wing tanks, 2 per wing, inboard and outboard, held the bulk of the supply. The Tokyo tanks, 9 cells distributed throughout each wing, provided auxiliary capacity. On takeoff, the tanks were filled to maximum capacity. Lady Luck was, in essence, a flying gasoline can with bombs attached. The formation assembly took 90 minutes. Bombers from across England spiraled upward through the morning haze, finding their assigned positions in a defensive combat box formation. Each box contained 18 to 21 aircraft stacked in staggered altitude. Multiple boxes formed a combat wing. Multiple wings formed the entire strike force. The geometry was precise, designed to maximize defensive firepower while maintaining bomb pattern density. Lady Luck took her position in the high squadron at 9:32 hours. Below and to the left, Patterson could see the lead squadron. To the right and slightly lower, the low squadron. All around, as far as the eye could see, B-17s and B-24s filled the sky, an armada of American air power heading east toward Germany. The formation crossed the English coast at Lowestoft at 10:15 hours, climbing through 15,000 feet. Navigator Brennan calculated they would reach the initial point, where the final bomb run would begin at approximately 13:20 hours. That meant more than 3 hours over hostile territory. 3 hours of constant vigilance, constant fear, constant exposure to whatever the Germans could throw at them. Patterson's intercom crackled. Pilot radio, P-51s joining formation. O'Malley had spotted the fighter escort sliding into position above and to the sides of the bomber stream. The sight of those sleek fighters provided momentary reassurance, but everyone knew the Mustangs couldn't stay forever. Fuel constraints would force them to turn back eventually, leaving the bombers to face the final approach alone. At 11:45 hours, the formation penetrated German airspace near Wilhelmshaven. The landscape below changed from neutral water to hostile territory. Every farm, Rye village, every city down there wanted them dead. Pilot navigator turning to heading 085, time to IP, 95 minutes. Brennan's voice was steady, professional, betraying none of the anxiety he felt. At 12:10 hours, the first fighter attacks began. Bandits 1 o'clock high. The call came from a dozen throats simultaneously. Focke-Wulf 190s diving from altitude in the classic German tactic, high-speed slashing attacks meant to disrupt formations and pick off stragglers. The FW-190s came in fast, cannon blazing, then rolled away before the bomber gunners could track them effectively. The P-51 escorts pounced. Mustangs dove after the German fighters, engaging them in swirling dogfights that drifted away from the bomber stream. Patterson watched a FW-190 explode in midair, hit by Mustang fire. Moments later, a P-51 spun downward, trailing smoke. The arithmetic of aerial combat played out at 300 miles per hour and 20,000 feet. By 12:40 hours, the fighter attacks intensified. Messerschmitt 109s joined the FW-190s. The Luftwaffe was throwing everything available against the raid. Ball turret gunner Chen rotated his turret to track a Me-109 passing beneath the formation. He fired a burst, tracers arcing through the thin air, but the German fighter was already gone, too fast to follow. Then came the head-on attacks. This was the most dangerous tactic, German fighters racing toward the bomber formation at a combined closure rate of over 500 miles per hour, firing everything they had into the vulnerable nose section where pilots and navigators sat behind thin plexiglass. The combined firepower was devastating. In the space of 3 seconds, a fighter could empty its cannon and machine guns directly into a bomber's cockpit. 12 o'clock level, here they come. Hastings in the bombardier's position had the best forward view. He hunched behind his bomb sight as 3 Me-109s bored straight in. The .50 caliber in the chin turret chattered. The cheek guns opened up. Tracers filled the air. One Me-109 disintegrated in a ball of fire just 50 yards from Lady Luck's nose. So close Patterson felt the shock wave rock the bomber. The other two rolled away, smoking but still flying. At 12:55 hours, ball turret gunner Chen reported what everyone had been dreading. Flak ahead, 10 o'clock level, heavy concentration. There on the horizon, a black smudge against the pale sky. The first flak bursts, and they were still 40 miles from Berlin. The German flak batteries had been tracking the formation for 20 minutes. Radar stations plotted altitude, speed, and heading. Telephone operators relayed targeting data to gun positions. Battery commanders calculated lead angles and fusing times. Everything was ready. The Americans were flying into a carefully prepared killing zone. By 13:05 hours, the flak reached them. Wham! The first burst exploded 500 yards to the left, a test shot finding altitude. Wham! Wham! Closer now. The German gunners were walking their fire into the formation like artillery adjusting onto a target. Each 88mm shell weighed 17 pounds and was packed with high explosive and steel fragments. The fuse was set to detonate at a specific altitude, turning each shell into a shotgun blast of supersonic shrapnel. The fragments, some the size of a fist, others small as pebbles, expanded outward in a sphere of death 30 yards in diameter. Each piece of metal was heated to hundreds of degrees by the explosion. And the Germans were firing hundreds of shells per minute. Patterson gripped the yoke tighter, fighting the instinct to take evasive action. They couldn't, not yet. They had to maintain formation, maintain course, maintain altitude. The bombardier needed stable flight for accurate bomb delivery. Until they reached the initial point, they were locked into this heading, flying straight into the flak field. Wham! A burst directly ahead, exactly at their altitude. Lady Luck flew through the expanding smoke cloud. Shrapnel rattled against the fuselage, the sound of gravel thrown against a metal roof. Morrison scanned the instruments, everything still in the green. They'd been lucky that time. At 13:12 hours, a bomber in the low squadron was hit. Patterson saw the flash, a direct hit on the wing between engines 2 and 3. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the entire wing erupted in orange flame, fuel tanks igniting. The B-17 rolled inverted and fell away, trailing fire and smoke like a comet. No parachutes. 10 men gone in 5 seconds. "Steady," Patterson said over the intercom, his voice calm despite the ice in his gut. "Steady, we're almost there." At 13:15 hours, Navigator Brennan called out, "IP in 5 minutes, Bombardier, it's your show." Hastings activated his Norden bomb sight and peered into the eyepiece. The German capital spread below, a sprawl of buildings, streets, rail yards, and smoke. Somewhere down there, flak batteries continued their deadly work. Somewhere down there, families huddled in shelters. War reduced everything to geometry, altitudes, headings, release points. "Pilot Bombardier, I have the airplane." Hastings's words meant Lady Luck was now flying on autopilot, guided by the bomb sight. Patterson removed his hands from the controls. They were committed now. For the next 6 minutes, they would fly straight and level while German gunners had a stationary target. The flak intensified to levels Patterson had never experienced. The sky turned black with bursts. The concussions came so close together they merged into a continuous roar. The bomber shook like it was in a hurricane. Shrapnel rattled against aluminum like hail on a tin roof. Wham, wham, wham. At 13:18 hours, a B-17 200 yards to the right took a direct hit in the bomb bay. The entire aircraft vanished in a yellow-orange fireball as 6,000 pounds of bombs detonated simultaneously. The shock wave hit Lady Luck like a giant fist, slamming the bomber sideways. Patterson felt his seat harness cut into his shoulders. His helmet hit the side window. Stars exploded in his vision. Morrison fought to keep them level. "I've got it, I've got it." "Negative, Bombardier still has the airplane." Patterson's training overrode panic. They had to complete the run, they had to. And then, at 13:19 hours and 40 seconds, everything changed. The concentrated flak burst erupted directly beneath Lady Luck's right wing. Not close, not near, directly beneath. 11 separate shell fragments, each roughly the size of a man's thumb, each traveling at over 4,000 feet per second, each heated to temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Fahrenheit by the explosion that birthed it, tore through the No. 3 fuel tank. The impacts came so fast they felt like a single massive blow. Patterson saw Morrison's eyes go wide. Flight engineer Mackenzie, positioned in the top turret directly above the wing, watched it happen in real time through the plexiglass beneath his feet. 11 holes. 11 pieces of superheated shrapnel punching through self-sealing fuel cells designed to handle small-caliber rounds and minor damage. 11 penetrations into a tank containing approximately 400 gallons of 100-octane aviation gasoline, a substance with a flash point of -43 degrees Celsius and an auto-ignition temperature of 280 degrees Celsius. The physics were undeniable. The fragments were well above auto-ignition temperature. The fuel was volatile. They were surrounded by exploding flak shells, any one of which could provide an ignition source. According to every principle of combustion science, every safety lecture, every engineering manual, Lady Luck should have become a fireball. But she didn't. "We're hit." Morrison's shout was redundant. Everyone had felt the impacts. Mackenzie's training took over despite his terror. Pilot, engineer, multiple impacts, right wing, fuel streaming from number 3 tank, heavy flow. Patterson's eyes snapped to the fuel prees. Sure gauges, number 3 tank pressure was dropping like a stone. 60 pounds, 40, 20. The fuel quantity gauge showed the tank emptying at an impossible rate. Through his side window he could see it, fuel vapor streaming from the wing root, a gossamer trail marking their passage through the sky, and they were still in the middle of the Flak field, still surrounded by explosions, still flying through a storm of fire and steel. "Bombardier, how long?" Patterson's voice was steady. Later, Morrison would marvel at that. The man's wing was gushing fuel surrounded by exploding shells, and he sounded like he was asking about the weather. 30 seconds to release, Hastings replied, his eye still pressed to the bomb site. Those 30 seconds expanded into eternity. Every man aboard Lady Luck understood what they were watching. The fuel stream was mixing with air, creating the perfect ratio for combustion. The temperature was far above ignition point. Hot shrapnel from ongoing flak bursts peppered the fuselage every few seconds. Any one of those fragments, any spark from metal striking metal, any static discharge. Wham! Another burst, close enough that Patterson saw the orange flash through his peripheral vision. Shrapnel punctured the right side of the fuselage. Waist gunner Price felt something tug at his jacket, a fragment passing within inches of his body. Still no ignition. The fuel continued to stream, the flak continued to explode, and somehow, impossibly, they continued to fly. O'Malley in the radio room was praying, not quietly, not to himself, but out loud over the intercom where everyone could hear. "Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee." His Catholic upbringing surfaced in extremis, words learned in childhood becoming armor against the incomprehensible. Chen and the ball turret directly beneath the damaged wing had the worst view. He could see fuel vapor swirling in the slipstream. He could see the continuing flak bursts. He understood better than anyone that if the wing ignited, he would be incinerated in his plexiglass bubble with no chance of escape. His hands gripped the turret controls so tightly his knuckles turned white. Bombs away! Hastings's call at 13:20 hours was the sweetest sound Patterson had ever heard. The bomber lurched upward as 6,000 pounds of ordnance dropped toward the Erkner ball-bearing works below. "Pilot, you have the airplane." Patterson didn't hesitate. His hands found the yoke and he rolled into a diving left turn away from the target area, away from the flak field, away from the burning city, away from the steel-filled sky that wanted them dead. "Pilot to crew, damage report, anyone hit?" The responses came back one by one, scared, shaken, but alive. No casualties, no wounds. Just the airplane bleeding fuel into the slipstream while they flew over the heart of Nazi Germany with 300 miles of hostile territory between them and safety. Mackenzie worked the problem. "Pilot engineer, number 3 tank is approximately 70% depleted. We're losing fuel at roughly 50 gallons per minute. The other tanks are intact, but we're contaminating the entire right side of the aircraft with fuel vapor. Recommend we shut down number 3 engine immediately to eliminate ignition sources." Patterson agreed. "Co-pilot, secure number 3 engine." Morrison's hands moved through the procedure automatically. Mixture control to idle cutoff. Magnetos off. Feathering button engaged. The propeller blades rotated to minimum drag position and stopped. The engine fell silent. One less potential spark source, but the fuel leak continued. Brennan worked his navigation tables frantically. "Pilot, navigator, recommend heading 270. That's due west, shortest route to friendly airspace. At current speed and fuel consumption, we'll cross the German coast in approximately 43 minutes. 43 minutes over Nazi Germany in a crippled bomber trailing fuel vapor. 43 minutes for German fighters to find them, 43 minutes for the damaged wing to fail structurally, 43 minutes for something, anything, to provide the ignition source that physics demanded. At 13:25 hours, the P-51 escorts began turning back. Fuel constraints forced them to abandon the bomber stream for the return flight to England. Lady Luck watched them go, their sleek silhouettes dwindling against the gray sky. The bombers were on their own now. At 13:32 hours, Tucker in the tail turret reported, "Bandits, 6 o'clock level, 3 Mi-109s, looks like they're setting up for an attack." The Messerschmitts had spotted a straggler, a bomber falling behind the formation, flying on 3 engines, trailing something from the wing. Wounded prey, easy kill. "Gunners, stay sharp, here they come." Patterson held the heading steady. He couldn't outrun them. He couldn't outclimb them. All he could do was trust his gunners and hope the old B-17 could absorb whatever the 109s threw at them. The first German fighter came in from 7 o'clock high, diving at 300 miles per hour with cannon and machine guns blazing. Tucker's twin .50 calibers answered, tracers arcing through the sky. The Messerschmitt's rounds walked up the fuselage, impacts stitching across aluminum skin. Glass shattered in one of the waist positions. Kowalski ducked as fragments sprayed around him. The Mi-109 rolled away, missing with its main burst. But it would come around again. They always did. "Pilot, engineer, we took hits in the fuselage. No fires, but we've got hydraulic fluid leaking now, and that son of a bitch flew right through our fuel stream." Mackenzie's implication was clear. The German fighter had just flown through a cloud of gasoline vapor at 300 miles per hour. Its engine exhaust temperature was hot enough to ignite fuel instantly, but somehow, once again, no ignition occurred. The second Messerschmitt attacked from 3 o'clock level. Price and Kowalski both opened up, their guns creating a crossfire pattern. The German pilot saw the tracers converging and broke off early, his rounds going wild. The third fighter tried a head-on pass. This was the most dangerous, a closing speed of over 500 miles per hour, both aircraft firing simultaneously, everything decided in 2 seconds. Hastings hammered the chin turret trigger. The cheek guns fired. The Messerschmitt fired back. 20mm cannon shells punched through Lady Luck's nose plexiglass. One round passed between Patterson and Morrison, so close they both felt the shock wave. It exited through the roof without detonating, a dud, another impossibility in a day of impossibilities. The Mi-109 flashed past overhead, missing by yards. Then it was gone, diving away with the other 2 fighters. Perhaps they were low on ammunition. Perhaps they saw the other bombers nearby and chose easier targets. Or perhaps they simply couldn't believe a bomber that damaged was still flying. At 13:45 hours, the formation began to scatter. The tight combat boxes broke apart as individual groups sought their own routes home. Some headed northwest toward the Baltic, planning to circle around the heaviest defenses. Others went due west, accepting Flak risk for shorter distance. Each group commander made his own decision. Patterson held heading 270, due west, shortest route, get this AI. Our plane and this crew to England by the most direct path possible. Pause. The fuel leak gradually diminished as the number 3 tank emptied completely, but the damage was done. Mackenzie's calculations were grim. "Pilot, engineer, we've lost approximately 600 gallons total. Remaining fuel 2,100 gallons. Distance to Ridgewell 420 miles. At current consumption on 3 engines, we're going to be very close. I mean very close." "How close?" "We'll make England, probably. We might not make Ridgewell. Might have to put down at a coastal emergency field." Brennan plotted alternate airfields. RAF Coltishall in Norfolk was the closest option, a fighter base with emergency landing facilities specifically for damaged bombers. If we aim for Coltishall, we have margin for error. If we try for Ridgewell, we're betting everything that fuel consumption stays stable. Patterson made the decision. We go to Coltishall. O'Malley, radio ahead. Tell them we're coming in damaged with fuel concerns. The radio operator began transmitting. Any station, this is Red Wing Baker 17, declaring emergency. Inbound your position with battle damage and low fuel state. Request priority landing. Over. The response came immediately. Red Wing Baker 17, Coltishall Tower, we copy your emergency. You are cleared for straight-in approach, runway 27. Crash crews are standing by. What is your position and fuel state? Coltishall, we're currently over the North Sea, approximately 60 miles east of your position. Fuel remaining approximately 45 minutes. We have engine shut down and battle damage to wing structure. Roger, Red Wing, descend at your discretion. Winds are 270 at 8 knots. Ceiling unlimited, visibility 10 miles. The field is yours. At 14:05 hours, Lady Luck crossed the German coast outbound. The crew watched the hostile shoreline fall behind with relief so profound it was almost painful. They'd made it out, but they weren't safe yet. 60 miles of North Sea remained, and every minute brought new concerns about fuel state and structural integrity. The damaged wing worried Mackenzie more than the fuel now. Pilot engineer, I'm seeing stress cracks around the damaged area. The self-sealing material is holding the holes closed now that fuel pressure is gone, but we've got structural concerns. Recommend we keep speed below 180 and avoid aggressive maneuvering. Patterson acknowledged. They were flying a wounded bird that could fail at any moment. Every vibration from the engines transmitted through damaged structure. Every slight turbulence flex-stressed weakened metal. The B-17 was legendary for absorbing damage and continuing to fly, but everything had limits. At 14:25 hours, England appeared on the horizon, a low dark line against the gray sea. Never had the English coast looked more beautiful. O'Malley raised Coltishall Tower again. Coltishall, Red Wing Baker 17 has the field in sight. Request landing clearance. Red Wing Baker 17, you are cleared to land runway 27. Winds 270 at 10 knots. Crash equipment is standing by. Patterson began a long, shallow descent. No aggressive maneuvering, no steep banks, just a gentle letdown toward the runway visible 12 miles ahead. At 14:32 hours, they crossed the Norfolk coast at Horsey with 800 feet of altitude. Below them, civilians stopped to stare at the damaged bomber limping home. Even from the ground, they could see the shredded right wing, the feathered propeller, the evidence of battle. Gear down, Patterson ordered. Morrison hit the gear lever. Hydraulic pressure was marginal due to the fighter-inflicted leaks, but the main gear extended and locked. 2 green lights, but the nose gear light stayed dark. Nose gear's not showing locked. Morrison cycled the gear lever, no change. It's extended but won't lock. Patterson absorbed this latest development with remarkable calm. Can we confirm visual? Hastings in the nose looked down through the bombardier's window. I can see the nose gear. It's down but canted slightly to the left. Doesn't look right. A gear-up landing was survivable, but it meant sliding down the runway on the bomber's belly at 100 miles per hour with damaged fuel tanks and fuel vapor still contaminating the airframe. The risk of fire was extreme. Patterson made another decision. We're landing with what we have. Hastings, Morrison, get to crash positions. Everyone else brace for rough touchdown. At 500 feet, Patterson reduced power on the 3 operating engines. The bomber settled toward the runway, descending through the afternoon air at 90 miles per hour. Fire trucks paced them along the taxiway, red lights flashing. At 100 feet, Patterson could see emergency crews positioned along the runway, an ambulance, foam trucks, firemen in asbestos suits standing ready. At 50 feet, he flared the bomber, easing back on the yoke. The main gear touched first, a solid thump of rubber on concrete. Good. Then the nose gear made contact. The weakened strut collapsed immediately. The bomber's nose dropped onto the runway with a grinding shriek of metal on concrete. Sparks flew. The propeller blades of the number 1 engine disintegrated as they hit the runway at 1200 RPM, fragments spinning off in all directions. Patterson and Morrison were thrown forward against their harnesses. The control yoke slammed into Patterson's chest, driving the air from his lungs. The noise was incredible, grinding, shrieking, metal tearing itself apart. But Patterson kept his hands on the yoke, keeping the wings level, keeping the bomber tracking straight down the center line. The rudder pedals still worked. Differential braking still worked. He could still control this. Lady Luck slid down the runway on her belly and 2 main gear, trailing sparks and debris, slowing gradually from 90 miles per hour to 80 to 70 to 60. The crash crews chased them in fire trucks, ready to douse any flames that erupted. But no flames came. Despite the sparks, despite the fuel vapor contamination, despite damaged tanks and ruptured lines and 11 holes that should have ignited hours ago, Lady Luck didn't burn. At 50 miles per hour, Patterson began applying brakes. At 30 miles per hour, the bomber was under complete control. At 10 miles per hour, they were coasting. At 0 miles per hour, 2,300 feet down the runway, Lady Luck finally stopped. For a moment, nobody moved. The engines ticked as they cooled. Small pieces of debris pattered to the concrete. Then Patterson hit the engine shutdown switches and the remaining 3 engines fell silent. "Everybody out now!" Patterson's voice was hoarse but commanding. The crew didn't need to be told twice. Within 30 seconds, all 10 men were climbing out through hatches and windows, desperate to get clear of the fuel-soaked bomber. They gathered 50 yards from the aircraft, watching as crash crews surrounded it with foam trucks. Firemen in asbestos suits approached cautiously, extinguishers ready, waiting for the explosion that never came. Pause. Station Engineering Officer Squadron Leader Philip Hastings, no relation to the bombardier, arrived in a jeep and climbed out. He was a veteran of 3 years of bomber operations, a man who'd seen every type of battle damage imaginable. He walked slowly around Lady Luck, taking in the shredded wing, the collapsed nose gear, the bullet holes, the flak damage. Then he climbed up on the wing to examine the fuel tank. The ground crew chief handed him a flashlight. Hastings shone it into the inspection port, studying the damage. When he climbed down 5 minutes later, his face was pale. He walked to where Patterson and his crew stood and stared at them for a long moment. "Gentlemen," he said finally, "by every principle of physics and chemistry I know, your airplane should have exploded over Berlin. I have personally examined the damage. 11 separate flak fragments penetrated your number 3 tank while you were surrounded by exploding shells in one of the heaviest anti-aircraft barrages of the war. I cannot explain why it didn't ignite. I simply cannot explain it." The formal investigation began the next morning. A team of technical specialists from the 8th Air Force Engineering Division descended on Coltishall to examine Lady Luck. What they found became the subject of classified reports that circulated throughout the Army Air Force's engineering community. The 11 penetrations formed a pattern across the number 3 tank that investigators initially thought was too perfect to be random. Each hole was roughly 3/4 of an inch in diameter, consistent with 88 flak fragments. The fragments had entered at high velocity, punching clean through both sides of the self-sealing tank without tumbling or fragmenting further. This was the first critical factor. High-velocity penetrations created clean holes without the shower of sparks that typically occurs when metal strikes metal at lower speeds. The fragments were moving so fast, over 4,000 feet per second, that they passed through the aluminum and rubber layers before heat could transfer effectively to surrounding material. The second factor was the positioning of the holes. The investigators discovered that the slipstream created a powerful Venturi effect across the damage pattern, literally sucking fuel out of the tank so rapidly that vapor couldn't accumulate in the ideal air-fuel mixture ratio for combustion. Instead of pooling and creating concentrated vapor, the fuel was being torn away and dispersed into the slipstream where it was too lean to ignite. The third factor was that none of the 11 fragments had struck internal tank structure, the baffles, ribs, and reinforcements inside the TAW. Every fragment had passed through empty space filled only with liquid fuel. Liquid gasoline is significantly harder to ignite than gasoline vapor. The fragments would have needed to create sustained sparking or remain in contact with fuel long enough for heat transfer, but their velocity meant they were through the tank in a fraction of a second. The fourth factor, discovered through detailed analysis, was that the explosion pattern of the flak burst had occurred in a specific phase of the aircraft's position relative to the shell. The fragments had come from slightly behind and below, meaning they were already cooling as they climbed to reach the bomber. While still hot enough to potentially ignite vapor, they were below the temperature at impact that they'd been at the moment of detonation. Investigators calculated the probability of all these factors occurring simultaneously: fragment velocity, penetration pattern, slipstream effect, lack of structural impacts, and thermal conditions. The estimated probability was less than 0.1%, and that was just for the damage itself not igniting. The fact that the bomber then flew through continuing flak barrages and fighter attacks without secondary ignition reduced the probability to nearly zero. But nearly zero is not zero. Lady Luck had threaded a needle of physics so narrow that most engineers couldn't believe it when they saw the evidence. The investigation board's final report, dated March 28, 1944, concluded, "The survival of B-17G serial number 4231367 represents an extreme statistical outlier in combat damage assessment. While the aircraft's self-sealing fuel system performed as designed, the specific damage pattern exceeded design parameters by at least one order of magnitude. The crew's survival should be attributed to a combination of robust aircraft design, proper emergency procedures, and an extraordinary confluence of favorable circumstances." In bureaucratic language, that meant they got lucky, very, very lucky. First Lieutenant James Patterson received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions on March 6, 1944. The citation specifically mentioned extraordinary skill and courage in successfully returning a critically damaged aircraft through 300 miles of hostile territory and executing an emergency landing with disabled landing gear. Flight Engineer Technical Sergeant Robert Mackenzie received the Air Medal for outstanding technical expertise in damage assessment and emergency procedures under combat conditions. The other 8 crew members each received Air Medals for their participation in the mission, but the real reward was simpler: they all went home. Patterson and his crew completed their tour of 25 missions on April 22, 1944, without loss of a single crew member, itself a remarkable achievement in the 8th Air Force, where overall crew casualties exceeded 50%. They returned to the United States in May 1944, where Patterson served as a B-17 instructor at MacDill Field in Florida for the remainder of the war. Lady Luck herself was repaired over a period of 6 weeks. The damaged fuel tank was replaced entirely. The wing structure was reinforced. New engines were installed. The nose gear was rebuilt. By late April 1944, she was flying combat missions again, assigned to a new crew. She completed another 43 missions before VE Day, surviving the war as one of the lucky B-17s that made it home. In August 1945, she was flown to a storage facility in Arizona, where she joined thousands of other surplus bombers awaiting disposition. In 1946, she was scrapped, cut apart for aluminum that would be recycled into civilian products. But her story lived on. Veterans of the 381st Bombardment Group told it to new crews as proof that sometimes, just sometimes, luck was more than a nickname. Engineering students at MIT studied the incident in classes on combustion physics and probability theory. Aviation safety investigators referenced it in reports on fuel system design. The March 6, 1944 mission itself was part of the larger strategic bombing campaign that broke the back of the Luftwaffe fighter force. While Lady Luck's crew couldn't claim spectacular individual achievements, they represented something equally important: the determination and skill of ordinary men facing extraordinary danger, mission after mission, day after day. Of the 730 heavy bombers dispatched to Berlin that day, 69 were shot down, a 9.5% loss rate. 690 men killed, captured, or missing. The human cost of the strategic bombing campaign was staggering. Over 26,000 8th Air Force personnel died in combat during World War II. Another 28,000 were taken prisoner. But they accomplished their mission. By March 1944, the Luftwaffe was in retreat. German fighter production couldn't replace losses. Experienced pilots were dying faster than new ones could be trained. The skies over Europe, once dominated by German fighters, now belonged to American and British aircraft. This was the context in which Lady Luck's story mattered. Not because 11 flak shells failed to ignite a fuel tank, though that was remarkable enough, but because 10 men faced death at 23,000 feet and came home. Because they flew again the next day and the day after that. Because they represented thousands of other crews who did the same thing, many of whom never came home. Patterson rarely spoke about the war after 1945. He returned to Iowa, married his high school sweetheart, and worked as a civil engineer for 40 years. When asked about his combat experience, he typically deflected, "I just did my job. A lot of guys had it worse." But in 1984, at a reunion of the 381st Bombardment Group, an interviewer asked him specifically about the March 6 mission. Patterson, then 64 years old, considered the question for a long moment. "You know," he said finally, "we called her Lady Luck, but luck had nothing to do with it. That airplane was built by people who knew what they were doing. Boeing engineers designed her to take damage and keep flying. Factory workers built her with pride and precision. Ground crews maintained her like their own lives depended on it, which they did in a way, and my crew knew their jobs. When things went to hell, everyone did exactly what they were trained to do. That's not luck. That's preparation meeting opportunity." He paused, looking at something distant that only he could see. "Although I'll admit, when 11 flak shells go through your fuel tank and don't light you up, maybe somebody upstairs was looking out for you too." The story of Lady Luck and her crew represents a single thread in the vast tapestry of World War II, one mission among thousands, one crew among hundreds of thousands. But it endures because it captures something essential about that conflict: the razor edge between survival and annihilation, the role of chance and probability in war, and the human capacity to function under unimaginable stress. Modern aviation safety owes a debt to incidents like this. The investigation into why Lady Luck didn't explode led to improvements in fuel tank design, better understanding of combustion physics in aviation applications, and enhanced safety procedures for damaged aircraft. The WWII self-sealing tanks, already effective, were refined based on data from this and similar incidents. The 11 men who flew Lady Luck home that day, Patterson, Morrison, Brennan, Hastings, Mackenzie, O'Malley, Chen, Price, Kowalski, and Tucker, scattered to the winds after the war. They returned to farms and cities, factories and schools, ordinary lives that had been interrupted by extraordinary circumstances. Some stayed in touch. Others never spoke to their crewmates again, the memories too painful or too private to revisit. By 2024, all of them had passed away. The last surviving member, ball turret gunner Raymond Chen, died in 2019 at age 96. With his passing, the story of Lady Luck transitioned from living memory to historical record, from something remembered to something researched, from personal experience to collective legacy. But the core truth remains. On March 6, 1944, over the skies of Berlin, physics and probability bent just enough to let 10 men come home. Whether that was luck, divine intervention, engineering excellence, or some combination of all three depends on your perspective. What is beyond dispute is that they faced the danger, completed their mission, and survived against odds that would make a mathematician weep. In a war that killed millions and destroyed nations, 10 men and a bomber called Lady Luck threaded the needle and lived to tell about it. Their story is not about technology or tactics, though both play a role. It's not about strategy or politics, though those provide context. At its core, it's about human beings tested to their absolute limits and finding within themselves the courage and competence to endure. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to WWII Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.